The wind sliced sharply, ripping at Hannah Carter's worn-out garment as she faltered along the icy, unpaved path, her youngsters grasping her attire on each side. Her son Eli, aged 8, endeavored to show fortitude, his little jaw set, yet his quivering digits revealed his fear. Clara, merely 7, had ceased weeping some time ago. Her small countenance, encircled by golden ringlets, was ashen. The child's lips, formerly soft and rosy, were now chapped and cyanotic. In their wake, the somber outline of the farmhouse stood menacingly, the dwelling she had considered her home from the time of her union with William. Now, it was merely a sepulchre, occupied by the frigid, scornful expressions of her late husband's relatives. Individuals who had previously welcomed her, who had once professed to be her kin, had, upon William's passing, allowed their sympathy to curdle into disdain. She possessed no entitlement to their shelter, they asserted, no right to sustenance or the comfort of their hearth. A widow was simply a liability, and 2 famished children only exacerbated the situation. The resonant slam of the barn door reverberated across the desolate terrain. Snow swirled underfoot as Hannah plodded onward, her footwear threatening to disintegrate. Uncertain of their destination, she understood only the necessity of continued motion. The heavens displayed a contused, grayish hue, portending further inclement weather. Trees bordered the slender trail ahead, their gaunt limbs oscillating like the digits of an invisible phantom. Hannah held Clara tightly to her bosom as the wind persisted. Each forward movement felt like a struggle against the very ground, as if the earth itself had plotted with her in-laws to consume her. Eli accompanied her in quietude, his cheeks chafed by the wind, his knuckles reddened from being clenched so forcefully. He had remained mute since their expulsion, even when his aunt had ripped the covering from his shoulders before forcefully shutting the door in his face. "I am capable of carrying her," Eli declared abruptly, his voice husky. "You are weary." Hannah's heart constricted. He was merely a lad, a child who ought to have been frolicking near the fireplace, not proposing to bear his sister through a wilderness that seemed determined to claim them. She managed a faint smile, shaking her head. "I am fine, my dear. Just stay near." The road meandered, vanishing into the woods. The further they ventured, the more silent the world around them became. Only the crunch of ice beneath their soles and the harsh sound of their breathing persisted. By noon, their bodies ached, their stomachs roiled with hunger. Hannah endeavored to concentrate on anything but the gnawing void that clawed at her insides, yet it was unyielding. Their last sustenance had been consumed 2 days prior. A piece of dry bread offered in pity before the door had been slammed shut. Clara whimpered. Hannah pressed her lips to the child's forehead. Too cold, too frail. "Not much further," she murmured, though she had no certainty if this was true. Eli stumbled, righting himself before he fell. He clenched his teeth, swiping at his face in exasperation. Hannah suppressed the tightness in her throat. "We will halt soon, find some protection." But where? The land stretched interminably before them, cloaked in white. The trees, though lofty, provided no sanctuary against the cold that gnawed at their very being. A crow cawed in the distance. Eli tugged at her sleeve. "There!" She followed his pointing finger. A small edifice stood just beyond the crest, partially obscured by the trees, a trading post. Hope ignited within her chest. With renewed determination, they stumbled towards the derelict structure. The wood was contorted by age, the door barely attached to its corroded hinges. Hannah steeled herself, then pushed against it with her shoulder. It groaned in resistance before yielding. Inside, the air was musty, heavy with dust and the scent of deterioration. Shelves lined the walls, largely empty, though a few shattered crates were strewn across the floor. A fireplace occupied a corner, long extinguished but still complete. She gently placed Clara down, wrapping what little material she possessed around the girl. Eli was already sifting through the scattered remnants. "Anything?" she inquired, her voice barely audible. "Not a great deal," he conceded, holding up a fractured bottle. "Some desiccated beans. Nothing fresh." Hannah nodded. It would have to suffice. She directed her attention to the fireplace. If she could ignite a blaze, they might endure the night. She reached for the flint she had taken from the farmhouse, her hands rigid from the cold. The initial attempt produced a spark, but the tinder was moist. She tried repeatedly. A spark took hold. A tiny ember glowed, then extinguished. Desperation gnawed at her. She struck the flint again, more forcefully this time. The ember grew. Smoke curled upwards. A flame. She exhaled unsteadily, cupping her hands around the fragile fire as it licked at the wood. Gradually, warmth began to permeate the space. Clara stirred, pressing nearer to the flickering light. Eli sat beside her, drawing his knees to his chest. For the first time in hours, Hannah permitted herself to draw a full breath. Outside, the wind persisted. The walls creaked under its force. Something shifted in the gloom. Hannah froze. A low snarl. Her pulse hammered. Eli tensed beside her. The snarl came again, nearer this time. She reached for the rusted blade she had discovered earlier, gripping it firmly. Her body urged her to flee, but there was no escape, no safe haven. The door, still partially unlatched, shuddered against the wind. A shadow moved past the opening. Not human. A wolf. Hannah pressed a hand over Clara's mouth as she stirred. Eli's breath was shallow, his wide eyes fixed on the doorway. The wolf sniffed the air. Another gust of wind rattled the building, and the creature advanced. Hannah's grip on the knife intensified. If it came any closer, if it lunged, she would defend them. The wolf emitted a low, guttural snarl, its eyes glinting in the firelight. Its fur was dense, dusted with frost. It took another step, then, as abruptly as it had materialized, it turned and retreated into the night. Silence. Hannah exhaled shakily, her hands trembling. Eli swallowed audibly. "Do you believe it will return?" "I do not know," she confessed. They did not sleep that night. The fire burned low, projecting flickering shadows on the walls. The wind never ceased, and Hannah knew, deep in her being, that this was merely the prelude. Dawn appeared over the horizon, painting the sky in subdued shades of gold and violet. As she gazed at the ascending sun, exhaustion weighing heavily on her shoulders, a shadow fell across the doorway, tall, silent. A figure stood there, observing them. Her breath caught. Not a wolf, not a bandit. Something else. The stranger remained motionless, did not utter a word, but Hannah knew with absolute certainty that everything was about to transform. The man remained unmoving in the entrance, his countenance obscured by the dim morning illumination. Hannah grew rigid, her heart pounding against her ribs as she held Clara more tightly. Eli pressed against her side, his breathing shallow, his fingers clenching the fabric of her attire. He was tall, with broad shoulders, his figure enveloped in thick pelts that carried the aroma of earth and smoke. His long, dark hair was plaited, resting against his chest, and his eyes, sharp, unyielding, studied them with quiet intensity. A bow was slung over his back, a knife secured at his hip. He remained silent. Hannah's grip on the rusted blade tightened, though she recognized it as a meager defense against a man of his stature. The fire had diminished, flickering feebly between them, casting shadows that danced across his impassive face. He could dispatch them if he chose. There would be no meaningful resistance, no opportunity to flee. The silence extended. Then slowly, he reached into the folds of his furs and retrieved something, a small parcel. He took one step forward, placed it on the ground, and stepped back. Hannah paused, her body tensed. The bundle lay there between them, wrapped in coarse cloth. Eli shifted, his voice barely a whisper. "What is it?" She offered no reply. She compelled herself to move, inching forward, never averting her gaze from the man. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, peeling back the cloth. Dried meat, a flask of water, a present. She swallowed with difficulty, lifting her gaze. He was still watching, unmoving, his expression inscrutable. She anticipated a request, some price to be exacted, a trade, an order, a caution. None was forthcoming. She did not rely on kindness. She had learned that kindness invariably came with a price, that it was something people employed like an instrument, like a weapon, only to withdraw it when it served their purpose. Yet there was no cruelty in his gaze, no amusement, no ill will, only quiet anticipation. She exhaled slowly. "Thank you." He gave no indication that he had heard her. Instead, he turned, stepping back towards the door, as if content with whatever unspoken understanding had transpired between them. "Wait," she blurted, surprising even herself. He paused, glancing back over his shoulder. Hannah hesitated, her throat feeling parched. The words lodged there, unwilling to emerge. She wanted to ask why he had aided her, why he had left them this provision instead of simply departing. Instead, she found herself gripping the food more tightly, as if it might vanish the instant he disappeared. The man did not urge her for words. He merely nodded once before slipping back into the morning haze. She did not encounter him again for 2 days. The provisions lasted longer than anticipated, carefully rationed among them. Clara grew stronger, her cheeks less gaunt. Eli ate quietly, his gaze flicking towards the door periodically, waiting. Hannah admonished herself not to entertain hope. The second time he materialized, she did not flinch. This time, he entered without pause, stepping inside as if he had already concluded they posed no danger. The wind gusted behind him, carrying the sharp bite of impending snowfall. Hannah straightened, willing her voice not to tremble. "Who are you?" He glanced at her, then at the fire, as if contemplating whether to respond. Finally, his voice broke the silence, rough-edged and low. "Cheyenne." The name hung between them, unfamiliar yet substantial. He crouched by the fire, holding his hands to the warmth, his movements slow, deliberate. Eli watched him with a wary curiosity, his fingers tightening around his knees. Cheyenne's gaze drifted towards the boy. "You are strong." Eli blinked. The words, though simple, carried significance, acknowledgement. He sat a little straighter, nodding tentatively. "Hannah, why are you assisting us?" Cheyenne did not reply immediately. Instead, he reached into his satchel, withdrawing a bundle of animal hides. Without a word, he handed them to her. Hannah hesitated, then accepted them. They were soft, thick, warm. She swallowed. "You are giving us these?" "You require them." Simple, certain. No expectation of recompense. She clutched the furs, feeling their heat against her frozen fingers. "I do not comprehend. You do not even know us." Cheyenne's gaze flickered towards the fire. "I know hunger." The words settled heavily between them. She studied him more closely then. The quiet way he carried himself, the manner in which he avoided superfluous movement, the keen awareness in his eyes, a man who had witnessed more than he cared to articulate. Silence descended once more, but it was different now, less oppressive. When Cheyenne finally stood, adjusting the strap of his satchel, Hannah found herself speaking before she could consciously decide. "Where are you going?" He met her gaze, his expression as inscrutable as ever. "Hunting." She hesitated. "Will you return?" A beat of quiet passed, then he nodded once. Eli, for the first time in days, smiled. Cheyenne came back the following evening, bearing the results of his hunt, a rabbit skinned and gutted, its meat fresh. He wordlessly handed it to Hannah, observing as she blinked in stunned silence. That night, they ate well. Days went by. The snowfall intensified, blanketing the land in unending white. Cheyenne did not depart at first. He came only in the evenings, his presence a quiet force in their improvised dwelling. But as the winter deepened, as the cold became unyielding, he stayed longer. He spoke little, but his actions were eloquent. He showed Eli how to construct traps, how to set them with patience and exactitude. He brought firewood, stacking it against the far wall. One evening, as Hannah struggled to sew a torn piece of cloth with benumbed fingers, Cheyenne took the needle from her hands and completed the task himself. She did not know what to make of him. The fear she had clung to, the distress that had once burned so intensely in her chest, was diminishing, replaced by something she could not yet identify. Clara had warmed to him rapidly. She would sit beside him, watching with wide, curious eyes as he sharpened his knife. He allowed her, never speaking, never pressuring her. Eli followed him with quiet respect, emulating his movements, eager to learn. And Hannah, for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, was not afraid. The fire crackled between them, casting long shadows on the wooden walls. Cheyenne shifted, glancing at her from across the flames. "Winter will not be lenient." She nodded. "It never is." His gaze held hers. "You cannot remain here." She swallowed. "I have nowhere else to venture." A pause. "Come with me." The word sent a jolt through her. She stared at him, searching his expression for something, anything, that might suggest deceit. But there was nothing, only quiet certainty. "You do not even know me," she whispered. "I know enough." She looked at her children. Clara curled up against the furs, her breathing soft and even. Eli, sitting beside Cheyenne, his hands calloused, his eyes older than they should be. A choice. She exhaled slowly, her grip tightening around the fabric in her lap. The wind howled outside. The fire burned low. And Hannah, for the first time since the world had turned against her, felt something stir deep within her chest. Hope. The trek away from the deserted trading post was unhurried, each footfall pressing them further into the untamed land, more distant from the world they had once known. Snow crunched underfoot, its mass heavy on Hannah's footwear. Eli walked near Cheyenne, emulating his cautious movements, while Clara rode upon the warrior's back, her small hands gripping the thick furs draped over his shoulders. Hannah maintained her separation. She observed him as they proceeded, attempting to understand the quiet strength in his gait, the way he barely produced a sound despite his considerable size. His presence disquieted her in ways she could not articulate. He had given her no cause for apprehension, yet fear had been her steadfast companion for so long that it refused to relinquish its hold on her so readily. The wind intensified, carrying the aroma of pine and moist earth. The trees grew more densely, their towering forms obscuring the gray sky. The deeper they ventured, the more Hannah comprehended how lost she would have been without Cheyenne's guidance. There were no pathways here, no landmarks, only endless white and the whispering voice of the forest. By dusk, they established camp near a rocky outcrop where the wind was less severe. Cheyenne worked with efficiency, gathering wood, striking flint against steel until embers ignited. Hannah drew the furs more tightly around Clara, observing the way Eli leaned in as Cheyenne demonstrated how to stack the wood correctly, how to feed the fire slowly so it burned consistently and strongly. She wished to speak, to express her gratitude, but the words felt alien on her tongue. Instead, she occupied herself with preparing what little sustenance they possessed. The dried meat he had given them days prior was nearly depleted, but Cheyenne had brought fresh game, skinned and cleaned with meticulous precision. As the scent of roasting meat filled the air, Hannah felt the initial pang of something unfamiliar, relief. Clara had warmed to him more swiftly than Hannah had anticipated. She sat beside him, her small hands toying with the fringe of his coat, tracing the beads sewn into the leather. He permitted her, unperturbed by her quiet inquisitiveness. When she shivered, he enveloped the edge of his cloak around her without a word. Eli was different. He desired to learn, to prove his worth. He studied Cheyenne's every action, from the way he tied knots to how he carved the meat. He posed no questions, only observed. Hannah found herself watching as well. As night descended, the firelight cast long shadows against the trees. Cheyenne sat opposite her, honing his knife with slow, practiced motions. His expression remained inscrutable, yet there was a stillness about him, a patience she had never witnessed in a man before. "Where are we journeying?" she finally inquired. Cheyenne did not interrupt his work. "My winter encampment." She swallowed. "How distant?" 2 days. The prospect of traversing the snow for 2 additional days caused her stomach to clench, but she compelled herself to nod. Clara had already drifted off to sleep, curled beneath the blankets, while Eli sat upright beside the fire, his eyes heavy with weariness. Hannah reached out, brushing the hair from his forehead. "Sleep," she murmured. He shook his head stubbornly. "I am not tired." Cheyenne glanced at him. "Rest is strength." Eli hesitated before nodding, stretching out beside Clara. Hannah waited until his breathing slowed before allowing herself to exhale. The night was quiet, save for the occasional crackle of the fire and the distant cry of an owl. Hannah felt the weight of Cheyenne's gaze upon her, steady and unwavering. "You do not trust me," he stated at last. She stiffened. "I do not trust anyone." His eyes flickered with an unreadable emotion. "Wise." She frowned. "Then why assist us?" He remained silent for a considerable moment, as if deliberating whether to respond. Finally, he sheathed his knife and leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You are alone," he said simply. "I have witnessed what befalls those left to fend for themselves." She swallowed, her fingers curling into the blanket draped over her lap. "And what do you anticipate in return?" His expression did not alter. "Nothing." She wanted to believe him, but life had taught her that men never gave without expecting something in return. They sat in silence, the fire burning between them. The next day the journey resumed, the terrain growing more challenging. Hannah's legs ached, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Cheyenne moved ahead of them, clearing the path, his presence a silent assurance of safety. They reached a river by midday, its surface partially frozen, jagged ice fracturing with the strong current. Cheyenne studied it for a moment before stepping onto the ice, testing its solidity. Hannah's heart pounded. "Is it secure?" He nodded. "Step where I step." She hesitated, then took Eli's hand. The ice creaked beneath them as they advanced. Clara whimpered, burying her face in Hannah's shoulder. The river below roared, dark and unforgiving. Hannah forced herself to continue, following precisely in Cheyenne's footsteps. A crack split the air. Her stomach dropped. Eli gasped as the ice beneath his foot yielded. Hannah lunged, grabbing his arm just as Cheyenne moved, swift as a striking hawk. His hand clamped around Eli's wrist, pulling him back onto solid ground before the ice could engulf him. Eli trembled, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Cheyenne crouched before him, gripping his shoulders. "Breathe," he said, his voice calm, steady. "You are safe." Eli swallowed hard, nodding. Hannah's hands shook as she pulled him close. She met Cheyenne's gaze over Eli's head, her chest tight. "Thank you," she whispered. They crossed the remainder of the river cautiously, reaching the far bank without further mishap. By the time they arrived at Cheyenne's winter camp, exhaustion weighed heavily on Hannah's bones. The camp was situated between towering rock formations, sheltered from the wind. A small fire pit sat in the center, surrounded by simple but sturdy shelters made of wood and hide. Cheyenne moved with quiet efficiency, setting down his pack, checking their surroundings. Eli sat beside the fire, staring into the flames, while Clara curled up beside him, her body finally succumbing to fatigue. Hannah hesitated before lowering herself onto the furs Cheyenne had spread out for them. "You are safe here," he said. She met his gaze, searching for deception and finding none. For the first time in months, she believed it. That night, as the fire burned low and the wind howled beyond the rocky cliffs, Hannah allowed herself to close her eyes. She did not dream of hunger. She did not dream of fear. She dreamed only of warmth. The days went by, each blending into the next as winter solidified its hold on the land. Cheyenne's camp became a sanctuary for Hannah and her children, a place of quiet sustenance. The nights were protracted and frigid, yet they were secure, and that security, though tenuous, was a solace she had not dared to anticipate in her darkest hours. She observed her children growing stronger each day. Eli, though still reserved, was more self-assured, his inquisitiveness now tempered with a newfound comprehension of the world around him. Clara, too, began to laugh again. the sound soft but genuine. Cheyenne moved through the days with a quiet presence, as constant as the mountains encompassing them. He hunted when provisions dwindled, constructing traps and tracking animals with a proficiency that astonished Hannah. His movements were always deliberate, his attention unwavering, as if the world existed in those moments of stillness and focus. And though he spoke little, she found herself observing him more and more, attempting to understand him the way he had understood her. She noted the way he cared for her children. Small gestures, like ensuring Clara was warm before he attended to his own tasks, or how he would instruct Eli in carving wood when he thought no one was watching. And there were the moments when their eyes met across the fire, when something unspoken passed between them, something she didn't know how to define, something she didn't know if she was prepared to acknowledge. But with every passing day, the weight of her sorrow began to diminish, replaced by something gentler, something quieter, a peace she hadn't thought achievable, not after the life she had endured, not after the loss that still tormented her. She didn't know if it was his presence or the land itself that had begun to heal her. Perhaps it was both. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future that wasn't defined by bereavement. One evening, as the wind howled outside the shelter, Cheyenne spoke to her for the first time about the past. It was late, the fire crackling low in the pit between them, and Clara had already fallen asleep, her head resting against Eli's side. Eli, too, was nearly asleep, his fingers still wrapped around the carving he had been working on, a small figure of a bear, clumsy but endearing. "You have endured much loss," Cheyenne said, his voice low but steady, as though he had been carrying the weight of his own story for a long time. Hannah shifted uncomfortably but didn't look away from the fire. She had become accustomed to the silence between them, but there was something in his tone tonight that made her feel vulnerable, exposed. "I have," she said quietly, her throat tight. She hadn't spoken of her husband's death since the day it occurred. The wound was still raw, still too fresh to touch. But Cheyenne had seen her grief, and in a way, he understood it without her needing to articulate a word. "Loss is a difficult burden," he said. "I know." Hannah nodded, unsure how to respond, but the truth of his words resonated with her. She turned her gaze to him, meeting his eyes for the first time in a long while. There was a depth to his gaze, an understanding that came from experience, from a life lived in the shadows of loss and survival. "I believed I would never find tranquility again," she said softly. I thought the anguish would never cease." Cheyenne was quiet for a long time, his eyes never leaving hers. Then, slowly, he reached out his hand, brushing the back of hers, a small, simple gesture, but one that made her heart race. It was the first time he had touched her in such a way, and it felt like the world shifted in that moment, just slightly, but enough to leave her breathless. "You will," he said, his voice gentle. "In time. But you must trust yourself, and you must trust others too." She swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling in her chest. Trust. She had spent so long constructing barriers around herself, excluding everyone, convinced that to trust was to be vulnerable, to be hurt again. But here, in this quiet corner of the world, with this man who had no obligation to protect her, she felt something stir, something raw and real. "I don't know if I can trust again," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I possess the strength." Cheyenne's fingers lingered on hers for a moment longer. Then he slowly withdrew his hand, as though sensing her hesitation. "You do," he said simply, the conviction in his words undeniable. "Strength manifests in many forms. It is not always about conflict or endurance. It is about relinquishing. It is about reopening your heart, even when it feels as though it will shatter." Hannah closed her eyes, his words washing over her like a quiet tide. For so long, she had clung to her grief, her anger, her fear, believing they were the only things that would keep her safe. But Cheyenne was right. Strength wasn't just about holding on. It was about knowing when to let go, when to trust again. The fire flickered between them, its heat warm against her skin, but it was the warmth between them that she felt most acutely. She had been so afraid of the world, so afraid of what could happen if she allowed herself to be vulnerable. But now, with Cheyenne beside her, with her children nestled safely under the furs, she realized that perhaps she had been mistaken. Perhaps there was more to life than fear. Perhaps there was room for hope. As the night progressed, she found herself leaning closer to him, drawn by the quiet strength that radiated from him, by the soft, unspoken promise in his gaze. And when he looked at her, truly looked at her, there was no pity in his eyes, only understanding, only acceptance. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Hannah found herself growing stronger. She learned to trust Cheyenne in ways she never thought possible. She watched him care for her children with a tenderness she hadn't anticipated, and in return, she found herself opening up to him, piece by piece. The wall she had built around her heart slowly began to crumble, not all at once, but in quiet, hesitant steps. One afternoon, as Cheyenne returned from a hunting trip, the sky heavy with the promise of another storm, Hannah was waiting for him by the fire. She had a question that had been sitting in her heart for days, and now, with the world quiet around them, it felt like the right moment. "You said I would find peace," she began, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "But what about you? What have you lost?" Cheyenne paused for a moment, looking at her with a gaze that seemed to reach deep inside her. His expression softened, and for the first time, he shared a piece of his past with her, of the tribe he had lost, of the family taken from him by the ravages of war. "In time, I lost them," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of years. "But I am not lost. Not anymore." Hannah's heart ached for him, for the quiet sorrow in his words. In that moment she understood something profound. There was no end to loss, no finality to the pain. But there was redemption in moving forward. There was hope in the strength to rebuild, to love again. As the storm rolled in, they sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames and the warmth of each other's presence, filling the silence between them. For the first time in a long while, Hannah allowed herself to believe in a future that could be different from the past, a future that might hold more than just survival. In Cheyenne's quiet strength, in his unwavering patience, she found something she had not thought possible, a chance at redemption. And with it, 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 and with